Hello, everyone. It is my real pleasure, and I really appreciate the Reverend Dr. Caleb, hopefully I pronounced it correctly, join me, and he will give to us an introduction or his perspectives of progressive Christianity. And I'm personally very intrigued. I always was named when I was a Christian, liberal Christian, so maybe he will clarify this mess of naming, or maybe there is not a mess. And I knew in my church that always liberal means bad. It was like a stray, bad, you understand, Christian. The true ones are conservatives or traditionals or whatever you name them. And for people who don't ever know about me, I was a Baptist. Right now I'm an atheist, but this is not the topic of this evening, even if you think. And but even when I was a Baptist, I was quite early exposed in a more non-traditional, like I was always accepting an older theory of evolution. We are related with things, some type of animal, which I will not name it because it will flame already the taste. And I was exposed with a lot of very literalistic, strong views. Like we were encouraged not to watch TV. Basically, Bible Belt for my invited, but it will be Romanian Bible Belt kind of.
Yeah.
You know this taste. So I will make a very small presentation about one thing about myself. So the way I was exposed to progressive Christianity, it was in two steps. One of them was about Jean-Dominique Crossan, Don. The first book, which I remember, changed my life. In this sense, it was this book. It was Jesus, a revolutionary biography. And it was what was the most stunning part for me. This is not a theological book, to say very frankly. It is describing the effects of antiquity, more or less. When you'd compare this book and I read, and it was popular at the time, A Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It is an apologetics book. The apologetics books would cherry pick few historical facts, but it will never give you the frame. And to me, it looked very dishonest. So this made me at least to choose a more scholarly take of the Bible. I mean, even I'm not a scholar, I would read popular books. And many people use today Bart Ehrman. I never read Bart Ehrman if it was popular. But to me, the popularizer and theologian too, and this is why I really appreciate it a lot. And I heard, or I think, he never said to me yet, Caleb was in the same team with Spong as part of progressive Christianity. So there are Christian books of him. And I personally love these two books. There are maybe more. Why Christianity must change over time. Here it says how to be a reasonable Christian in the 21st century. And this one is about Book of Matthew, biblical literalism. And it basically dissects or describes to you how the Gospel of Matthew was written, and at least from the point of the author of Matthew, you will not be able to be literal. So these books were, I have them not because I only have them in the library, but they were important to me in my growth and as a liberal Christian. There will be definitely other books, you understand, on the chain.
Yeah.
But to me, when I hear you are a Bart Ehrman, some people comment, this was never, I was having these views as a Christian. And okay. So how did you get here, Mr. Caleb?
Sure. Yeah. So Caleb Lines, and just a brief kind of a biographical note. I serve as co-executive director of progressivechristianity.org with my friend Mark Sandlin, and we have been running this organization for a few years now. But the organization progressivechristianity.org, I think, has been involved in doing a lot of the definition of what it means to be a progressive Christian, both in the United States and around the world, for the last 25, almost 30 years. And we've done that through our 8 points of progressive Christianity. They're now our 5 core values, our core values of progressive Christianity. So I do that. And I'm also a pastor of a congregation, University Christian Church in San Diego, which is historically a part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, but is now also affiliated with the United Church of Christ and the Progressive Christian Alliance. So yeah, I didn't grow up conservative. Actually, I grew up in rural Missouri, which is a part of the Bible Belt. It is a very, what we would call in the United States, a red state. You know, it's very conservative. And in fact, I went to college in a place that we call the buckle of the Bible Belt. So it's fundamentalism really shapes all of the way that people interact with the world, the way that they see life. But I grew up in Christian Church Disciples of Christ congregation, so that's a mainline Protestant denomination in rural Missouri, and it must have been one of the very few progressive congregations in that rural part of the world. And so kind of my model for ministry was I had a pastor who was very progressive and who had a weekly newspaper column. And so he would write about progressive theological issues, and he would write about progressive social issues in his newspaper article. This was back in the day, you know, when there were a lot of newspapers. And I remember that would make waves in the community. And so kind of my model for what Christian life looked like was inspired by that, by kind of this progressive Christian pastor who was making statements that were controversial, but felt to me like what I read in the Bible. So standing on behalf of human dignity and standing on behalf of the marginalized, and theological concepts like love and inclusion. And so, in fact, as a child, the first place where I heard messages of affirmation for the LGBTQ plus community was in church. So I grew up in a church in rural Missouri that was talking about how we ought to be standing on behalf of our LGBTQIA neighbors. And so I realized pretty early that I wanted to go into ministry, and I decided to go to a secular religious studies program to study. I didn't go to, you know, a private college where they could teach kind of confessional religion. I went to a public university. I didn't want that. I wanted my base learning to be secular learning about what we actually knew about the Bible. And so I went to the secular religious studies department and was introduced to the historical critical method. And actually, my advisor studied under Bart Ehrman. So I read a lot of Bart Ehrman, and I think Bart Ehrman is a wonderful scholar. I think he's one of the best scholars in doing work on New Testament stuff right now. And you know, I was influenced by this historical critical method and learned about how the Bible was put together, the process for selecting which texts were going to be in the biblical canon. And I also was doing comparative religion kind of stuff. So I was learning about other religious traditions and learning about the history of religion and the philosophy of religion. And so all of that in a secular religious studies department is what kind of formed my base understanding. So I learned all of that stuff before I even really started talking about theology. I mean, other than the way that we talked about theology in church, which was a progressive mainline denomination. So I then went to Yale Divinity School for a couple of different master's degrees. And while I was there, you know, some people were kind of being introduced to the historical critical method for the first time. And for them, that was really earth-shattering for a lot of people. I always found it kind of life-giving to know how the text was actually produced, because it meant that a lot of the things that I had heard, not from my church, but just from people growing up, fundamentalism was kind of in the water, you know, that you had to believe that. Whenever I learned about the historical critical method, I said, oh, you don't have to believe all that stuff. So then whenever I started learning theology and talking about what people thought about the biblical text, well, I was already in a place where I could form my own opinions about that. And so I didn't put my faith together, I think, in the same way that a lot of people do, which is that they just kind of accept what people have told them. So I too have been inspired by John Dominic Cross and John Shelby Spong. ProgressiveChristianity.org had a long history of relationship with John Shelby Spong before he died. We still manage his listserv and are the keepers of all of his writings that were not owned by HarperCollins. So all of his weekly newsletter and stuff. But I was particularly influenced by Marcus Borg. And and especially meeting Jesus again for the first time. And in that, he talks about these stages that we go through, you know, pre-critical naivete, critical thinking, and post-critical naivete. And in that, he says, you know, that pre-critical naivete is that stage where you just kind of accept things that are given to you because someone that you know and accept as an authority figure told you that it was true. So say a parent or a pastor or somebody tells you that the world was literally created in 7 days, that you just accept that because somebody you know and love told you that it's true. But then you get to the stage of critical thinking where you say, I'm learning in science class that the earth was created over the process of billions of years, and that evolution is the most likely way that we explain how human beings came to be. That doesn't jive with what I learned in church. And that critical thinking stage where you learn that there's a disconnect and that you have to kind of deal with that. And so people then go to different places when they reach critical thinking, right? Some people say, well, you know, then that means that none of the stuff in religion is true because that it doesn't compute with what I'm learning that we know to be true scientifically. And then other people will say, well, take the other side, right? I'm going to reject all of it because what my faith told me is true and none of the rest of this is true. So I really was inspired by Borg's approach, where he talked then about moving past a stage of critical thinking, which is dichotomous, right? And instead moving into this post-critical naivete where we can recognize that the Bible can be true even if parts of it aren't factual. And so I that kind of had informed my way of thinking about theology. And so by the time that I was ordained, I was much more in the school of John Shelby Spong and Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, and thinking about how it is that we apply what we know to be factual about the Bible, what we know to be true about the socio-historical context in which the biblical texts were written. I applied that to my ministry. And so the first congregation I served was a very academic congregation, just a couple blocks actually away from the university where I had done my undergraduate degree. And so that was very well accepted. People expected a historical critical analysis of the text. That was just a part of our culture. And then when I came to my current church, I chose this church in particular because it was a congregation that understood that at the heart of Jesus's message, which is maybe something we'll talk about later, is a message of social justice on behalf of those who are marginalized. And they let that inform then who they were and how they approached theology. And so it was a great fit for me because that was the way that I had understood the gospel and the central point of Jesus's message. So then my involvement with progressive Christianity, I think, made a lot of sense because it was very much kind of how I interacted with the world. In a lot of ways, I didn't really ever understand fundamentalism. It was never a part of how I was trained. It was never a part of how I interacted with the world, other than I saw it all around me and I saw how dangerous it was.
Can
And
I
so,
interject a bit?
yes,
Or
absolutely.
you want to go, if you say, okay, so I had some kind of outline. So I would go with the next part because you kind of started and we will go back if you. So to me, I was very often encouraged to read the Bible as is. You understand? And the first time, take it literal. Then if it's not, it's a metaphor. And maybe you know this kind of steps just to let loose as little as much of being as literal, like sola scriptura, things like that. Yeah. Do you think it's reasonable to keep this view if you are kind of informed with a kind of scholarly apparatus, like, I don't know, from I forgot this Gospels discussion, I forgot his name, when you pick the sources to how the Pentateuch is written or how they reinterpret many things, you understand, and they interpreted it, things which we don't take them as Holy Ghost given, whatever. If you accept this kind of scholarly view, do you think it's reasonable or possible to match with a quite close to literalist view of the Bible, or how do you think is this tension?
Yeah. Well, let me put it like this. I think so everything that I was just talking about is stuff that people learn in pretty much every seminary. Like the historical critical method, the way that biblical texts are put together, that's something that you learn no matter if you go to a liberal seminary or if you go to a conservative seminary. Any seminary that or divinity school or secular religious studies program that is intellectually honest is telling you that the gospels, for instance, were written, several decades after Jesus was crucified, that it was that they were composed through engaging with oral and some written traditions, and that, and all modern scholars who are intellectually honest believe in what we call Markan priority, right? That the Gospel of Mark was written first around 70 of the Common Era, and then that Matthew and Luke used Mark and in the mid 80s, and then that John came along later, sometime in the 90s. Everybody accepts that. Everybody, whether they're religious or not, whether they're conservative or liberal, everybody who's intellectually honest accepts that as the most probable scenario. So everybody who goes to an ATS accredited seminary in the United States, there are other obviously accrediting bodies elsewhere in the world, but Association of Theological Schools is who accredits schools in the U.S. Everyone who's been to an ATS accredited school has learned that. And I went on that rant then to tell you this, that then pastors go back to their churches and pretend like they don't know any of that stuff. And I think that's one of the biggest sins that we see committed by the church today. Yeah, because it's not intellectually honest. And if we say we love the Bible, which a lot of people do, they're like, oh, I love the Bible so much. Like, well, if you really love the Bible, then don't you care about how it was factually put together? I mean, we know this. Scholars know this. So I think it depends on if people are being intellectually honest about how they come to those conclusions or not. And so, am I one that believes that that God wrote the Bible? Well, no, I don't believe that. However, if there are pastors who say, well, perhaps, if they have a Trinitarian view, perhaps the Holy Spirit was involved in this writing, and that God was still present in it, even if it came 40 years after Jesus was crucified. Then I think that's different, right? Because then they are at least being intellectually honest with themselves. They're talking about something which they cannot fully understand, the mystery of God, with something that they can understand, which is how the biblical text was put together. And they are allowing those things to coexist. But I think you have to tell the congregation about that. I think you have to tell other people. So I think for me, the main barrier as to whether or not something is acceptable as theology or not is whether or not it's compatible with the central message of Jesus, which I don't think is what most Christians think it is. But I know that you and I have talked a little bit ahead of time, and I know that you want to get to that question, so I won't spoil it yet. But I think ultimately, if theology is doing harm to others, it is bad theology, and it's inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus Christ. If it is life enhancing, if it is working on behalf of those who are marginalized, if it is supporting other people,
then so it's clear this dichotomy sometimes that is in the church versus the scholarship. I will put only one question about this modern scholarship. So this is one part which kind of surprised me a lot. Is like people quote the Bible, and some things are definitely in the first century context. You can't get around it. Like I don't know. And to me, just to say, I think we can, probably we will both agree that Paul doesn't talk against LGBT, but let's take this for granted. Paul talks about LGBT. You understand? This could be his understanding of the first century Greco-Roman culture, which was very different from ours. Like we have a lot of things that you understand that everything in the context of antiquity, it is so anachronic for us. Like today we hear a lot of scientific stances or things like that. Mm-hmm. And these were not concerns even at the time. So I personally, this is the part which I don't understand, and maybe you have your views on it. like Revelation says it's not a future text. You'll never see Revelation around. I think you have the same view.
Yeah.
You understand the views. Even Jesus had some view about something. You have still to adjust it to today's. There is no Samaritan today's, for example. Samaritans,
or are there? I mean, I think so. I think that depends on how you like. If you know the historical context.
Exactly. Yes. So if you adapt it
Yeah.
to see, many things will not turn into today.
Yeah.
So LGBT, even Paul it will be about abuse of some type of LGBT relation. It will never be about LGBT consenting, loving relation, which people have it. You understand? You can't put some parts of Paul. Even Paul would say them. You understand?
Yeah.
So how do you think it's fair to say biblical scholarship kind of disables, if you are fair, some of these toxic messages which you see, especially around abortion, which I would say there is nothing in the Bible, LGBT, which are typical the parts which are used by many
so
conservatives.
I think the way you're demonstrating that is the perfect way to think about how modern scholarship ought to interpret the way that we view the ethical teachings in the Bible, because I think the Bible at its heart is about human search for meaning and human search for understanding that which is not fully understandable by human beings, and they use stories to teach about ethics, and I think certainly Jesus in particular was concerned about ethics. So let's take the example that you just gave about the Samaritan, for instance. Like, okay, well, if we know the historical context that Samaria was once and Judea were once a part of the same kingdom, and then they were split because the northern kingdom was conquered first, then you know that in Jesus's time, that Samaritans were seen as kind of half-breed Jews. They were seen as, they were not fully, they were looked down upon. They were foreigners, right? And so they would have hated the Judeans, and the Judeans would have hated them. And so in the story of the Good Samaritan, you get two religious leaders who come by who are concerned with purity in their culture, right? If they had gone and helped the person who was on the side of the road, they would have become ritually impure, and they wouldn't have been able to go to the temple and do their jobs. They would have had to go to the mikveh, this ritual cleansing bath, and it would have been a whole thing. And so they could not risk their ritual purity. So Jesus here is talking about ritual purity, right? He's confronting the purity system. I think that's the main rub he had with the religious leaders of the day. And so we then see a foreigner who comes in and helps, but not only helps, goes to extravagant lengths, right? Puts this guy on his donkey, takes a guy to the inn, pays the innkeeper to take care of him, says, I'm going to come back. I'm going to pay any additional expenses. So I think this demonstrates how we use the Bible as an ethical text, right? We know that. Now, it's not just a nice guy who came along and was like, oh, I'm going to be kind. No, it was someone who had every reason to hate the other person, who had probably heard racial slurs his whole life from Judeans, and maybe had said some himself, right? So then I think the question becomes, how is it that we see people in our society, and who are the Samaritans of today? I mean, is it the refugees at the border? Are they the Samaritans of today? Is it Muslims in the Middle East? Who is it that we are looking down upon? Who is it that we have been taught by our culture to see as enemy, and who Jesus tells us through God that we ought to love? So I think abortion is another interesting example of this, right? Because I think it is a great example of how one actually reading through the Bible can demystify some of this, and how biblical scholarship helps us to understand it. So a lot of conservative Christians, even maybe mainstream Christians in the US, think that the Bible condemns abortion. Well, it doesn't. I mean, what people will do is they'll take text completely out of context, like say, take from Psalm 139, you formed me and know me, you knit me together in my mother's womb. And they use that to try and justify life beginning at conception. But I mean, if you actually just, I don't know, take the time to read that psalm, you see that it's about the psalmist's desire for intimacy with God. It's clearly a metaphorical kind of thing. He wasn't trying to scientifically define life because he had no notion of what that was. It's about the psalmist saying, you're with me from the beginning of the day until the end of the day, from the beginning of my life to the end of my life, no matter where I go in the world, right? It's not a scientific explanation of when life begins. So in the Bible, the only real example we have of the Bible giving any kind of theological justification for when life begins is in Genesis, where Adam, humanity, breathes in for the first time, right? It's defining life at first breath. But we know through biblical scholarship that in that ancient world, life was precarious. It was hard to be pregnant. Childbirth was precarious, and a lot of children died. There was a high infant mortality rate. So in this culture, children weren't considered to be fully alive until their naming ceremony. And because you didn't know if the kid was going to die or not, and it was a preservation thing to make sure that you didn't get so emotionally attached. And so that's what we see in Luke when Jesus is at the temple getting named. And in some ancient cultures in the ancient Near East, some cultures waited up to a year to name a child, right? So what we see is that in the ancient world, they actually waited later to define life. They defined it later than we do today, not earlier. I think
even if you
that
take it as the
also
first, sorry to interrupt you, even if you take it just as the first breath, it is still not in the womb. You don't breathe in the womb.
That's right. Even the theological justification, that's not the socio-historical, even the theological justification that we get in the text, is later than we would find today, which is one of the points that I want to make here, that this is one of the issues with using an ancient text to interpret modern sensibilities, modern ethics, if we don't really have a full understanding of what the text means, right? Because today we would find it morally reprehensible to say wait 8 days to define that a child is truly alive, or even first breath, right? Like say in the United States, we have laws about late-term abortions. There's a certain point where we've kind of agreed, and there's a lot of debate about where that actually should be, but society has kind of agreed that at a certain point, no, the fetus, it would be, might be viable outside of the womb. And so that's a point at which we as modern people have used our intellect to say the ethical thing to do here is to try and protect that life. But we have scientific knowledge to help us through that. So I think modern scholarship is extremely helpful in thinking about biblical ethics, because through modern scholarship, we can gain the perspective we need to interpret the text, I think, the way that they were originally intended to be interpreted.
So then there is the flip coin of that question. Yep. So modern scholarship say, I think that Genesis or the creation, it's, I think, to me, it's 500 years distance. There are, I don't know which version of documentary hypothesis you accept, 4 sources or 7 with early Deuteronomists or whatever. And Jesus died for Adam's sin. What happens if you drop the Genesis? I heard of it in my church. You drop Jesus' sacrifice. What Jesus died for, what you remain out of Christianity if you drop a historical Genesis, for example.
Well, I don't think we should drop the book of Genesis, but in terms of but I think we need to realize that that it's not historical. None of it's historical. So about this specific question about Jesus being atonement for human sin, right? What's called usually penal substitutionary atonement. It goes kind of something like this. God created human beings that were flawed, and then God got angry with human beings for being flawed in the way that God created them to be. So in order for God to appease God's self, God sent God's son, Jesus, who was also kind of God, to suffer on behalf of humanity so that God would then die as a sacrifice to God so that human beings would not be punished for who God created them to be. So you see, just in me explaining that, how terrible that theology is, right? It makes no logical sense. And what's more, look, this doctrine of original sin was invented by Augustine. So Jesus, when he was hanging on the cross, dying, it would have had no idea what original sin was. If someone said, "Oh, you're dying for the sins of humanity," Jesus would have been like, "What? What does that? What do you mean?"
Why me?
Right, because that theology had not been invented yet. It wasn't invented yet. So I think one thing that scholarship helps us to realize is we've talked a lot about historical critical method,
I
but
will mix it with the next question, probably that link.
Sure.
So what is it
About who
about?
Jesus is and Jesus's
Yes.
relation to God. Yeah, I think that's a good call because this is important, right? Because we've talked a lot about historical critical method, but a literary method is also very valuable, right? And so we need to understand what stories do and what their purposes are. And so, for instance, the creation story is an etiology, Etiology, etiology.
From
And so
ethics,
it's
right? From ethics.
right. Yes, right. A story that is designed to explain why the world is the way it is. That's the function of that story. Why is there suffering in the world? Why are there men and women? Because they didn't have a
I
knowledge
think
of
we
a
strictly the term is
spectrum of gender
myth,
identity.
the myth, but myth not like a fairy tale. Myth like a
Right. Yes, myth, but
okay, please.
with the intentional purpose of explanation for the world, because there are different types of myths, right? And
I
so I
agree.
mean,
Yes.
for instance, the flood myth, right, which is
Yes.
one that exists across several ancient cultures, right? And so it serves a slightly different purpose, but this one I think is designed to show why the world is the way it is. So yeah, so as you could tell, that I don't think that Jesus's purpose of life was to live and die. And I think this is one of the problems with the way that a lot of people understand Christianity, all the way back to the historic creeds, is that creeds focus almost entirely on theological statements that have nothing to do with Jesus's actual life, right? Like who he was, and then how he died, and all that. It's basically stuff that we can never know. Um, and those creeds were not a part of early Christian tradition. And so, as you all probably already know, and your viewers probably know, that early Christianity was very diverse. And early Christians didn't have a unified view on who Jesus was. That there was everyone from the Jewish Christian adoptionists who thought that Jesus was fully human, but adopted by God at his baptism, so not divine, at least not until that point, to Marcionite Christians who thought Jesus was so divine that he was just like a phantasm, right? Like a ghost, and like even his crucifixion only appeared divine. So early Christians, most of whom never even met Jesus, were divided on who he was. So if we're talking about who Jesus was about and Jesus's relation to God, I like Marcus Borg's understanding of this, that there have been people in our world throughout history who have been spirit people, right? People who have had a connection to that great mystery beyond us, to the divine, what we might call God. And certain people have had such a strong connection that they can communicate teachings to help the rest of us get in touch with that in a unique way. And he proposes then that Jesus is one of those spirit people. And I find that argument to be very compelling. And so uh, I think then that Jesus was a spirit person. Jesus was someone who was in touch with this divine reality, both within us and beyond us. And he was especially attuned to the fact that we are all connected and that there is a lot of injustice in our world. So a lot of people would say that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, right? That's a stance that was held by the proto-Orthodox Christians in early Christianity that then was kind of formalized through the ecumenical councils in the 4th century. But that notion is based on these two titles that Jesus was given, the Son of Man and the Son of God. And people don't tend to understand what those titles actually meant. So
I agree. I just made a clip about that Son of Man. It is really funny that I will talk about Mark chapter 2. Sorry to go directly with the reference. People ask, why do you heal this paralytic? How could you forgive? Are you God? This is what critics of Jesus say. And he says, don't you know that the Son of Man can forgive sins? So he clearly specifies, I'm not God. Exactly there, at least on the paralytic passage. He says, I'm not God, I'm Son of Man. And people say, no, Son of Man is God. I personally don't get it. In the passage saying, he criticized not being God. But I wanted to comment one thing a bit earlier, because when you put this title, to me, what I found about the crucifixion in particular, it is worse for other reasons. This punitive or something. Even the Gospels, even they try to interpret it like this, they don't say Jesus died for this. Jesus died on a cross. It couldn't be for the sins of humanity. People got on the cross on many reasons, at least academically. And the other part, at least for me, which was a clincher or something like that, when you see his trial, why was he charged? Because he said he's the Messiah, or depending on which gospel you choose. So this is not for the sins. Why you are arrested? Because you are thought wrongly, let's say so, that you are a Messiah. It's not for the sins of humanity. This was shoehorned or something like that. You have to come with many, you understand, like John interpretation, like he's the lamb.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, that the different gospels interpret them differently. I mean, Mark's original version of the gospel didn't include the resurrection narrative, for instance. But I think you're onto something here too, that Jesus was not crucified for the sins of humans, right? But he was crucified because of human sin. Right, because of the inequity in the world and stuff. And it's tied into what we were just talking about.
Right.
So Son of Man, it can just mean human being, but it also was a messianic title. And so Jesus, his followers confessed, was the Messiah, who was supposed to be a warrior king, who was going to overthrow the powers that be, in this case, the Roman Empire, and reestablish a united kingdom of Israel. And Jesus didn't have any interest in doing that. Right? He talked not about a kingdom, an earthly kingdom, but instead the basileia, or the reign, the kingdom, the basileia of God. So he was, you know, the Messiah, which put him at odds with the religious leaders when his followers confessed that. And Son of God was a title that was reserved for the Roman Empire. There are several other people who were called Son of God in the ancient world, but the emperor was called the Son of God. And if you were to be a Roman, you had to confess the emperor as the Son of God and a God. And so when his followers confessed Son of God, it was a political statement. So both Son of Man and Son of God were both religious and political statements that put him at odds with both religious and the political leaders. But I should say that it is not the religious leaders who executed Jesus. If they had, they would have executed him by stoning, and they could have done it on their own. It was the Romans, and they executed him for sedition because they were afraid that he was going to lead a violent revolution. That's what the Messiah was literally supposed to do. And they didn't realize he was talking not about a violent revolution, but a non-violent revolution of the heart. And so why was Jesus crucified? Well, as a part of those titles, he was talking about the radical social reformation that needed to happen, about inequality, about Roman oppression. And whenever he was talking about these things, it put him at odds with the Roman Empire. So that's why I say he didn't die for penal substitutionary atonement. That's not historical, and it's bad theology. It was invented later. Jesus wouldn't have even known about it. He died because of humanity's sins, because the world was such an unethical place, especially for people living under the thumb of the Roman Empire, under Roman oppression, that it was for standing up to that oppression because of the sins of humanity that Jesus was crucified. So for me, that's an important distinction.
I agree. So I think it's quite clear. If not, I would recommend. I know more Spong books. Borg was, I don't know, was not popular. I heard honestly Spong,
Right.
so I should read Borg. I was told once again from someone else who I said about Spong, you should read Borg. So my fault. Yeah. So this is a bit. I said to you criticisms which you'll hear before, like why are you not conservative or traditional? So to me, at least, it feels like at odds not only the scholarship with the conservatives but apologetics in general. And what I'm strictly speaking is that I will not name apologetics writers, but they kind of cherry pick historical facts to give the happy story, if you know what I'm talking. There are whatever numbers of manuscripts of the New Testament, but there was not say there are just 20 in the first century or first century, but we have 15,000 manuscripts. And even though these 20 manuscripts are only fragments, pages, most of the times. So to me, at least when I discovered both the, let's say, educated or whatever, I don't want to say this, I don't educated, but modern biblical scholarship and apologetics, to me, it looks like it hurts because it looks Christianity to be dishonest. Does it feel the same to you? Or
Yeah, I think that I have zero interest in trying to defend Christian doctrine. I have zero interest in trying to bring people to Christianity for the purpose of their souls being saved for an afterlife. I'm not interested in any of that because I think it's inauthentic to the teachings of Jesus. I don't think that's what he taught, the historical Jesus. I think that when we look at what the historical Jesus, the actual guy who lived, breathed, and walked on this earth, what he actually taught, what he talked about was social justice for those who are living on the margins. So that's what I care about. And I think that whatever path helps us to get there is an authentic path. And so if that path is Christianity, great. Let's deconstruct the bad theology of all of that. But great. If it's through Buddhism, great. If it's through Islam, great. If it's through Judaism, great. Or Hinduism, great. Or atheism, great. Or agnosticism, great. Whatever it is, that's fine as long as our theology is ultimately life-giving, life-enhancing, not just for us personally, but for the world in which we live, and particularly those who are being oppressed, that is a valid way of interacting with the world. And, we often will talk about different paths to our ultimate reality, right? And that the paths may take, go through some different places, but ultimately, as long as they're headed to that place of love, then that I think is the most significant thing. As far as like how would
I don't know, I heard this criticism, and I would say, have you heard about the metaphor of the elephant? It's a Hindu one or Chinese one, that there are 5 blind people which touch parts, and they say this is a wall, but they touch the belly of the elephant. This is a snake, and they touch the tail. I would say this is a tree, and they touch the trunk of the elephant. This is an old, like the cave story, but it's a Far Eastern. And my understanding of this mythological story, or how you name it, explanation story, is that people, at least in the Far East or Eastern view, is that God, it's already in millions of forms or thousands of shapes. Do you take the same kind of stance, like God could be in a monkey, kind of. I'm not
Or-
saying exactly like a monkey, you understand, but
I think that the way that we make sense of the world all has partial truth, which I'm not familiar with the proverb that you're talking about, but that I think it is. I think that the way we interpret truth is all a matter of perspective. I'm not talking about living in a post-truth society, because I think that that's something different and dangerous. But what I'm saying is that the mystery beyond us, which we are all searching for, that some of us name as God and some of us don't, um, is something that we interpret through our own life experiences and our own culture. And so part of this is knowing our own social location, right? So why am I a Christian? Well, because I was born in middle America in the United States, and that was the predominant religion. However, I do choose to remain in Christianity because I find it to be an important mediator for me in how I see the world. And so I think it's the same for others. Had I been born in India, I very likely would have been a Hindu, and I would have made sense of the world in that way. And so I think that that's a valid way of making sense of the world, and that we ought not condemn other people. But I do think as Christians, then the way that we ultimately determine whether or not what we are doing is consistent with the teachings of Christ, and I think the way that we determine whether actions in the world are ethical actions or not, since Christ is our primary mediator for that as Christians, is through the criterion of love. So I think that Jesus gave us the criterion of love. So looping back to where we started at the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus is asked, what are the greatest commandments? He didn't make these up. He pulls them out of the Hebrew Bible. They've already been tied together, but he says, love God and love neighbor. And they said, well, who's our neighbor, right? This is Luke's version of, and he tells the story of Good Samaritan. And so he tells us that love is the central of our theology. So the center of our theology. So all of our actions must pass the criterion of love. And to kind of encapsulate what we talked about in this whole time together, is that any theological interpretation that we have must pass the criterion of love. And if it doesn't pass the criterion of love, then it's not compatible with the teachings of Jesus, and it's not good theology.
it reminds me a bit of Beatitudes also, which they say that, for example, the beauty of Beatitudes, in my understanding, is this antithesis of how the life is, and like I forgot in English form, but for example, blessed are the weak because they conquer the world. But we know that the weak, they never conquer the world. The strong conquer the world. So
Right.
you have to, when you go out, exactly, you don't say love outside typically. This is how you can do it. This is how I understand it also, like Jesus not being only saying love, but to reflect on it, like the world is really unfair and you should replicate in the opposite way. And
that's a good point. And I mean, we don't have time to get into it
yes,
all, but I mean, that's
yes.
what the Basileia of God is about flipping the expectations of the world on its head. And that's why Jesus tells us first to be citizens of the Basileia of God, the reign of God, the kingdom of God, because it is a place in which those who have been poor and hungry are given that which they deserve, right? Where there's a great equalizing of the world. And that's what the Basileia of God is about. And I think what Jesus's primary teaching was.
So I think you kind of covered a bit, but this is excluding the one more question. How do you see progressive Christianity in this divided world? How do you see it placed in Christianity or outside of it?
Yeah, so we talk about progressive Christianity, and earlier you asked me about the division between kind of liberal Christianity and progressive Christianity. And I would say, at least in the US, because it's different depending on where you are, right? I just recently had a conversation with someone in Australia about their issues with progressivism. And I said, actually, in the United States, using the term progressive is very important because it actively means not regressive, which is what which is what much of Christianity in the United States has been. But I think, liberal Christianity tends to, when we use that phrase, at least in the United States, we tend to be talking about kind of the social gospel movement of the early 20th century, that was kind of a liberal Christianity. And I think progressive Christianity includes a lot of other things. I think it includes being an openness to being informed on, say, liberation theology and queer theology and womanist theology and feminist theology and postmodernism and all of these other movements that are going on at the time, with the recognition that our understanding is never static. And I think in the early part of the 20th century, there had been an assumption, mostly by white men who were leading that movement, that scholarship was going to bring us all the answers that we wanted, and that we had found the correct interpretation of the Bible. And so I think progressive Christianity recognizes that we don't have all the answers, that we will never have all the answers, and that we ought to be open to always hearing other voices, particularly when they are voices from communities that have historically been marginalized. So I think one of the other ways that we talk about progressive Christianity is that while we're living in the 21st century, while we recognize that God is still doing things in the world, that we also kind of look back. So it's in some ways kind of like the Roman god Janus, right? You're looking forward, but you're also looking backwards at the teachings of Jesus, the historical teachings of Jesus. And I think as progressive Christians, we tend to see ourselves as kind of Jesus originalists, right? To get rid of, you can't, I'm not saying that we're not informed or shaped by our own social location, but I'm saying that there are certain things that we can know about Jesus, and in some ways, getting rid of 2,000 years of crap isn't a bad thing. Like this, recognizing that the theology was invented and that we don't have to believe that because Jesus didn't teach it, I think is a good thing. So certainly progressive Christians see ourselves as Christians. I see myself as a Christian. There's a lot of baggage that comes along with that, and what people assume about me or what I believe or how I ought to be. But I think that progressive Christianity at least strives to be an authentic version of Christianity that is informed by Jesus's historical teachings and the work that is being done by modern communities that have been historically marginalized.
I want to comment one thing is that to me, I think from outside, when I was having any doctrine which was not by the church, Orthodox to name it so, even I was Baptist, everything was named liberal. And I also noticed in US, speaking people, especially the red state, whatever is liberal is bad. So I really think, at least as name, it's a good thing, at least in a Baptist world, Romanian Baptist world with imported US culture, to not use word liberal. Just as marketing, even it's not the right. You understand why? Because liberals are whatever, they break every convention. They are whatever.
You also have the debate about, like, are you talking about classic liberals, or are you talking about liberal within its own context, and it means something different depending on where you are? And I think. And I think actively, one thing that progressive Christianity is trying to do is to make progress towards the basileia of God, a community, a world in which everyone is welcomed, in which there is justice for all those who have been historically oppressed, where we treat each other with respect and dignity, and to use theological language, where we see every person as a child of God, a being with inherent worth and dignity, or to use human rights language, where we recognize the humanity in every single person, because that is a part of basic human ethics. To recognize that every person has worth and value, and that we ought to be working for human rights.
I agree. I will have one question
Yeah.
from the public to say so when I made a post. It's not mine, so if it makes no sense, my apologies. So, uh, why progressive need or pretend to have a better understanding, I think, of Christianity, I assume, than traditionals?
So
This
I
is
think
a
that
literal translation. Yes.
I appreciate that, and I have heard the criticism before, and I think it generally comes from a place where, I think it's a perception that's not accurate, right? Because it's not that, like, I, for instance, think that I have a better understanding than all the rest of progressive or all the rest of Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. It's just that I've been willing, and other progressives have been willing to take the things that we have learned, that scholars have agreed upon, and to allow that to influence our faith rather than doing it the other way around and allowing what we already believe because we've been told it's true to influence the way we interpret facts. And I just don't think that's ever a good thing to do, because we all have inherent biases and we can never let go of those inherited biases or the embedded theology that we have, the inherited theology that we have. But I think that if we start from a place where we are looking at what we know to be true about the world, knowing biblical composition, respecting the text enough to recognize where it was written, what the culture was concerned about, which to me, as I said, is loving the Bible because you're giving it the respect it is due to understand it, to understand who wrote it. That if you allow those things to help you interpret the Bible, well, then it's real tough to hold on to fundamentalist views. It's really hard because the text, I think, is written in a community that is moving more towards justice. So I had a Hebrew Bible scholar in seminary who's a professor, and he said this. He said, look, if you read the text with 21st century eyes, of course things will be seen as unjust, right? Like, for instance, we were talking about abortion earlier. There's a text in the Bible about how to perform an abortion. There are texts in the Bible about how, what we would call today fetuses are property and not human life. Like, that's in the Bible, right? We see that as problematic today. So if you look at it and just take it out of its context, there's a ton of stuff that's morally not just problematic, but reprehensible. But if you look at the Bible as a whole, you can see it as a movement towards justice, a gradual movement towards justice as society progresses, right? So I think a good example of this is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth.
Yes,
We have
I want to interrupt one thing. I want to remark one thing for atheists, to not criticize only Christians.
Yeah.
There is a lot of social justice also in the Old Testament. And
that's
yes,
exactly
I want to
right.
I make to make clear, because people say, are these evil passages what atheists quote? It's always Old Testament.
Yeah.
I want to make clear, for example, the widow and the orphan, for example, are central, which Jesus references back. For women not to divorce them, Jesus comments back, but it goes on top of already some social justice that was imposed, let's say, by Moses. I will use in quotes Moses, but you understand. So just people to not misquote you and to think that only Old Testament has reprehensible things, have also social justice definitely also in the Old Testament.
Right. I mean, even as I mentioned earlier, that whenever Jesus gave the greatest commandments, like I said, he did not come up with that. He took it from the Hebrew Bible.
Leviticus and Deuteronomy, yes, for the love your neighbor. Like
so, but the argument I'm making here is that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that we read with 21st century eyes as something that is ethically problematic, was justice because it was outlining unproportional retaliation, right? If someone poked you in the eye and you killed them, that is an unethical retaliation. So that was a just verse. It was about equity, right? And so we understand that, and we know that the verse is about equity. And then when Jesus comes along, he reinterprets that again within his own tradition to say, actually, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I'm saying go beyond simple matters of justice and love even your enemy, even those who persecute you. So I think that understanding the text in that way as a movement towards justice, which did not end with the book of Revelation, right? That we continue to be a part of that movement towards justice if we're living our lives correctly, that we are always progressing towards a more just society.
That's very great, and I really appreciate this comment. I think, I don't know how much you want to be around, but we agree kind of for 1 hour, more or less. If you want, we can still stay more. If there is any last moment questions, we would listen. But if not, would you want to close some remarks? Say to you, I'll put the resources for your page and Progressive Christianity in the description after the call. Do you have anything else that you'd want to close us about yourself, how to contact you, how I contacted you? You can say whatever you feel like.
Well, sure. Yeah. Just let me close by just saying this, that I think that we all have much more in common than we have different. And that's not to say that all religions are the same. That I hate that, because it's not true. Religions have different ways of understanding the point of life and the sacredness of life. And folks outside of religion have different ways of understanding that. We're not all the same, but we do all, I think, hold certain core values as human beings. And whether religion is the way we make sense of that or not, I think that holding each other as sacred is something that we all have in common. And so I think, the focusing on the ways that we can work together as a society, I think, is extremely important. It's one of the most powerful things that we can do, is to say, these are the things we can work together on. Let's make progress on those things. I think that's true even just within Christianity, that, a lot of people in Orthodox Christianity, a lot of people who consider themselves Christians, are not going to believe, no matter how much reason I present, no matter how much historical critical evidence I show, people aren't going to believe that, like, Jesus didn't die to atone for original sin, And so maybe theologically we're not going to agree on that, but can we agree to work for systemic change so that we don't have people who are living on the streets homeless? I mean, can we agree that that's an ethical teaching of Jesus, and can we work on that together? Can we agree that we are called to welcome the widows, the orphans, the strangers, people who are historically marginalized? Can we agree on that? And can we find ways as Christians to try and ensure that there is systemic change and personal change? And I think at the end of the day, that's what it's about. I don't particularly care what you believe, as long as it is ultimately life-giving, both for you and for this world. And I think that that fundamentally, Jesus's teachings are about those kinds of things that I was talking about working for the reign of God on earth, where everyone has enough and everyone is welcomed. So I'm grateful to be a part of Progressive Christianity. I'm grateful to be here with you. I'm grateful to serve both progressivechristianity.org and University Christian Church in San Diego. You can find my content on any of those pages, or my personal content on Reverend Dr. Caleb J. Lines. That's my tag on either TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or calebjlines.com. And always happy to speak with people and to help dismantle bad theology and to help give historical context. thanks for asking me to be here and join you today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate, and I am really grateful, and I don't know why even you accepted, but I'm really glad for it. I gave you one poem about us. It's a song about pelican. Did you enjoy it? Did you understood it? I want to say also a story why I put it, and then I will close. The pelican song, please.
Tell me why you put it. I want to hear why this was significant for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a band which was named Phoenix. That was the band, the Phoenix. You know, the bird which burns. It was a Romanian band, and they were making a protest song in the communist times. But how they make it, they said it's about a canary. It's a bird that lives and cries for freedom and tries to run, and he's the cage and dies as he's the cage and dies hurt. So this is the poem initially. So they remake another song about right now we are after freedom, after you know we are under the communist oppression, and then this pelican lives and thinks alone in a lake about the freedom but it's only in his mind and to fly. It's the same band. So that's the full story, and I thought it's interesting even as a Romanian trivia story.
It's a story of resurrection, right? Even if it's mental resurrection, and just to tie a knot on what we've been talking about today. I mean, that's the story of the phoenix rising from the ashes, right? It's the story of resurrection. The story of Jesus is a story of resurrection. But I don't care if people believe it's a literal resurrection. Fine. If they don't, that's fine. I don't believe in a literal resurrection, but I do believe that resurrection happens. And for Christians, I think that one of the ways that resurrection happens is when we implement the teachings of Jesus, the calls for justice, when we let our lives model that, then Jesus is resurrected. We are being Christ. We are Christ to the world. We're embodying, the Buddhists talk about a Buddha nature, right? Buddha nature, whenever we're embodying Christ nature, that we are going out and being like Christ, and that's resurrection. And so that kind of resurrection, I think, is possible, and I think it's hopeful. And so ultimately, even if the resurrection ends up being in our minds at first, I think that it is that we can have hope and have hope for a changed and transformed world. So I'm hopeful about that and longing for that resurrection.
Thank you. Beautiful. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.